Oh,
Okay, I think we are good to go. Thank you all so much for having me tonight. My name is Lisa Mason, and I'm a horticulture specialist and entomologist with Colorado State University Extension in Arapahoe County. And so let's dive right in. I do want to mention the CSU Extension mission. We are the outreach branch of the university, and our mission is to bring science-based education to local communities across Colorado. If you're not familiar with CSU Extension, you have a local county office. So I encourage you to check out our website and learn more about classes and programs and services offered in your own county. As a horticulture specialist, our horticulture team offers a lot of services like diagnostics. If you have a sick tree or you're wondering how to remove that turf grass, maybe your tomato plant isn't doing too well, or maybe you're just looking for tree IDs or ideas on new trees to plant, whatever your question is, insect identification, we got you covered. Please reach out to us. Some of our offices can do site visits, and then we do a lot of public programs and presentations. So I put our website on the slide here. That is our statewide website, so you can navigate to your county. And we also have free gardening webinars. So if you enjoyed tonight's presentation, do check out our recorded webinar page as well. So tonight we're going to talk about insect friends and foes, and I want to share a quick story about why I decided to become an entomologist, why I study bugs. And really that started back when I was an undergrad studying forestry at Colorado State University. My first job out of college was working at the Colorado State Forest Service, and this was at the height of the mountain pine beetle epidemic. And if you've lived in Colorado a long time or you visit the mountains frequently, you probably remember driving up I-70 with a sea of red and dead trees. And you can still see a lot of that beetle kill today. Fresh out of college, educating people about the mountain pine beetle was an eye-opening experience for me. This little tiny beetle, the size of a grain of rice, had such an enormous impact on us, on humans, on the economy, on tourism, and it was just devastating to lose all those green trees and the forest that we know and love. So that really got me learning about how insects impact our daily lives for better or worse. And that led me to go back to graduate school to study entomology. And by the way, as devastating as the mountain pine beetle was, it's a native bark beetle, a cyclical insect, and it was doing the job that Mother Nature needed to do. We had been suppressing wildfires for so long, we had a lot of really old, stressed out forests. Mountain pine beetle, they don't like to eat trees older than about 80 years old or older. So it was really their way of starting over, starting the forest over. And it's hard to see, but they if you go to like Rocky Mountain National Park, you can see new forests growing today. So insects impact our daily lives, and the more I learn, the more fascinating insects become. All right, so let's dive into our presentation tonight. We're going to talk about why we care about insects. We're going to talk about our beneficial friends. And then we'll talk about some insects, friend or foe, depends on who you ask. And then we will end with talking about some foes in our garden. So why do we care about insects? Well, at the end of the day, we cannot survive without insects in our world. E.O. Wilson was a famous biologist and naturalist. He estimates that humans would only be able to survive a few months without insects. So we definitely rely on them in many ways that we don't even think about. Why do we need insects? Well, insects play a vital role in nearly every ecosystem. Pollinators, they pollinate flowers, facilitating plant reproduction. We'll talk more about that. Decomposers, this is the ecosystem cleanup crew. We rely heavily on our decomposing insects to remove bacteria, to recycle things like dung back into the soil. Our decomposers play a very important role. We also rely on insects to prey on other pest insects. For instance, Who likes mosquitoes? Nobody likes mosquitoes, but they are a food source for so many different insects and other wildlife. Insects will also prey on things like aphids and other pests. Natural enemies against invasive species. The more invasive species spread, this will become more of an area of research. One great example here in Colorado is Japanese beetles. If you struggle with Japanese beetles, we'll talk about them tonight. Um, they feed on over 300 types of plants. And so Dr. Whitney Cranshaw does biocontrol research, releasing tachinid fly, a parasite fly that specifically targets Japanese beetles. So that can be a great solution for invasive pests. Insects provide food for other organisms and for humans. And so I mentioned, insects feed so much wildlife, birds, fish, amphibians, reptiles. Did you know grizzly bears in Yellowstone National Park feed on miller moths? That's a very important food source for them. So they're really the foundation of so many of our food webs in our ecosystems. Humans, not so much in the United States, but in other parts of the world, insects can be a vital, sustainable protein source for humans. And we get products from insects. Most common, honey, of course, we get from honeybees. Next time you put a teaspoon of honey in your tea, think about how it took 12 honeybees their entire lives to make that 1 teaspoon of honey. They are hard working bees. We get silk from silk moths. And another product you may not realize is carmine extract. We have scale insects on cactus, even here in Colorado. And those insects have a red dye in them. And so a lot of our cosmetics, red velvet food cake, and other red items that we consume are from those scale insects. They get that red dye from them. So, the more you know. And dung beetles. Have you ever thought about a world without dung beetles? Think about that for a minute. Dung beetles recycle dung back into the soil. So without dung beetles and other decomposing insects, dung would be left over from when when bison roamed the West. And in addition to, our cattle industries, heavily depend on dung beetles. It's estimated that dung beetles save the cattle industry $380 million a year. So we have all kinds of dung beetles. Rollers that roll dung in a ball that they use for food and breeding, just like in the picture here. We've got tunnelers that bury the dung, and we've got dwellers, beetles that just live in that dung. And if you're wondering how the African dung beetle navigates, or other insects navigate, they often use the moon and the stars. And there was a study specifically on the African dung beetle that showed if you put them in a lab, they get very turned around and very disoriented. So the conclusion of their research study was that they use the Milky Way to orient themselves at night. Very cool. Insects are incredibly diverse. And so if you look at the pie chart on the left, that is what is all the species in the world, what is currently described. Over half of all the species in the entire planet are insects. We have so much biodiversity in insects. There are still hundreds of thousands of species that probably have yet to be described. So scientists project that if all the species in the world were described, it'd be about 44% are insects. So nearly half of all the species in the planet are insects. And how does that translate to numbers? Well, for insects, over 800,000 species of insects have been described. If you compare that to plants, only 400 to 500,000 species have been described. And when you look at vertebrates, only 50,000 species have been described. So, and varying estimates from different scientists, some scientists estimate we've only described 1/2 to 1/3 of all the insects in the world. So, an amazing amount of biodiversity. So let's dive in and talk about some of our garden friends. They really fall into three different categories: predators, parasites, and pollinators. So a predator is going to actively prey on other insects. A parasite is going to seek out a host insect, and the larva of that parasite insect will consume the host insect. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And we'll talk about pollinators too, which are common garden visitors in our landscapes. So our first predator is a popular one: lady beetles or ladybugs. We have over 80 species here in Colorado, and they are ferocious aphid eaters. I put a photo of every life stage in this because I think this is really important. Beetles go through a full metamorphosis just like a butterfly. And so the adult beetles are commonly recognized, but did you know immature lady beetles look like the following top two pictures? To me, they look like little baby dragons. And right now in my own backyard, the aphids are everywhere, and I'm seeing baby ladybugs, the ladybug larvae everywhere. They're all over my hose. They're all over the pine trees. It's really great to see. So these larvae will eat all those aphids, and then they'll form into a pupa and turn into an adult lady beetle. They love aphids and other soft-bodied insects. Now, a common question I get is, should I buy ladybugs at the garden center? And the short answer is they're probably not going to be great for pest control because adult ladybugs can fly. So they will likely fly away and find their own food source. So in your own garden, probably not going to be the most effective. They are a native species, though, that you would find. So I tend to save ladybug releases for when I'm educating kids. I always bring ladybugs to my niece's birthday party because I think educating children about insects is important. But in terms of that biocontrol, probably not the most effective thing. Lacewings. Lacewings is another popular one. Whether you realize it or not, lacewings provide so much benefit in your garden. They are also ferocious aphid eaters. And so here is a picture of the larva. They look similar to lady beetles, but they're brown and they don't stand out quite as much. Notice these pinchers, though. Those pinchers are to catch those aphids and tiny little caterpillars in your gardens. And here's what the adults look like. They have these beautiful lacy membranous wings. They hold them like a tent, like this, and you'll often see them fly around your porch lights, for instance. Completely harmless to humans, but they love to prey on those aphids. If you have an aphid infestation in your garden, I highly recommend looking for lacewing eggs. So look at this. The eggs are on these little stalks. You'll find them underneath leaves. I found some lacewing eggs on a leaf of my ash tree just last night. I was so excited. And these will hatch and they will eat all those pesky aphids in your landscape. Syrphid flies. Now, syrphid flies don't get enough credit because they really provide double benefits for us in our gardens. They are pollinators, but they're also predators. And so the larva of a syrphid fly looks like this little worm. Often it doesn't really stand out. Sometimes they're hard to find. But these little larvae feed heavily on aphids and other soft-bodied insects. So this is their larval stage. When they become an adult, they are flower visitors. Now, flies, many species of flower visiting fly mimic bees and wasps. We'll come back to that. But so they may look like a scary stinging insect, but syrphid flies are completely harmless and provides double benefits in our gardens. Praying mantis. Praying mantis are commonly seen here in Colorado. We actually have 7 different species. The 5 native species you're more likely to find out on the eastern plains in the grasslands, but you may come across 1 or 2 species here along the Colorado Front Range or the West Slope. The one you're most likely to find is the European mantid. European mantids can be green, and sometimes a brownish color. These insects are excellent hunters. They have, look at their forearms here, or they're actually legs technically, but these forearms are used to grasp prey. They hunt and they stalk their insect prey, and they can quickly grasp them. The other unique feature about praying mantis is they are the only insect that can actually turn its head to find its prey. So you'll see that in a praying mantis. Like if you pick one up, it can actually move its head. Now, praying mantis are opportunistic hunters, so meaning they don't really care if it's a pest insect or if it is a beneficial insect. It's going to hunt whatever is easiest to find. And so consider that, you can buy Chinese mantid egg cases for biocontrol. Now, again, praying mantis, they're very mobile, just like adult lady beetles. So they will disperse and they probably will not stay in your garden setting. They will move around to wherever they can find prey. So not the most effective biocontrol, and they are opportunistic. So they'll prey on the pests, but they may prey on insects you want to welcome to your garden. Chinese mantids often don't survive the winter, but European mantids can. You'll probably notice occasionally the uthikas or egg sacs here on this branch. Sometimes you'll find an egg sac maybe on patio furniture or a fence. And if you see something like that, know that it is a praying mantis egg case. Okay, here's some common parasites. Now, tachinid flies are sometimes larger flies, and they have spines on them, which you can kind of see in this picture. So, at first glance, it might look a little bit alarming, but these flies cannot bite humans at all. They're very specialized, and they actually will seek out their host insect, and the female will lay her egg on that host. The egg will hatch, and that larva, the tachinid fly larva, will consume the host insect, and that's how that larva will complete its development. I know that's a little bit morbid, but that's how parasites like tachinid flies work. They rely on those host insects. So again, they're offering pest control services in our garden, and very cool to see if you get the chance to see one. Decomposers. Okay, this is a very common one that I think it's important to point out. The bumble flower beetle. This is common in garden ecosystems because bumble flower beetles are decomposers. They feed on organic matter. And so what happens is this beetle is it's a scarab. So we have thousands of species of scarabs. One species that people are most familiar with are Japanese beetles. And so oftentimes the two get confused. How can you tell the difference? Well, Japanese beetles tend to be metallic in color. Bumble flower beetles tend to be this dull brown, shades of brown. And also you can see bumble flower beetles have hairs on their bodies. Now, a common question I get is when people come across the grubs. Both Japanese beetles and bumble flower beetles have C-shaped grubs, like in this picture here. How do you know the difference? Well, if you love bugs, you can actually look at them under the microscope at the tip of their rear end. It's a little tiny pattern of hairs that distinguishes all the different species of scarabs. Promise you don't have to do that though. If you find these C-shaped grubs in your compost pile, or in a vegetable garden, it is not Japanese beetles. Japanese beetle grubs will only be found in turf grass. That is their only food source as larvae. So I'll repeat that. Japanese beetle grubs only feed on turf grass. So you will not find Japanese beetles grubs anywhere else. If you find these C-shaped grubs in a compost pile, maybe a raised garden bed or a flower pot, these grubs are feeding on organic matter, and they are probably the bumble flower beetle. So how do we attract these predators? Well, in addition to their prey, they love flowers that provide nectar. They all need that nectar, and some of them even feed on pollen. So plants like dill, fennel, or my personal favorite is moon carrots, yarrow, sedums, alyssums. There's a lot of great options for flowers that provide nectar, and that can help attract beneficial insects to your landscape. Okay, I'm gonna pause for a second. I know there's a few questions. Um, Okay, yesterday I saw some bugs that looked similar to ladybugs, but they were a bit bigger, more round, and didn't have black spots. Trying to figure out what kind of bug it was. Nicole, based on your description, it's probably a ladybug, a species of lady beetle. There is one, it's called, I think it's called Leconte's giant lady beetle, which is actually a lady beetle without spots. So try Googling even giant lady beetle, and I suspect that might be your answer. If not, try to snap a picture and send me an email. Okay. What insects do tachinid fly larvae feed on? Do they target specific bugs? The short answer is yes, and different species target different insects. So it is a little bit variable. The tachinid fly, for instance, that Dr. Cranshaw is experimenting with biocontrol for Japanese beetles. That tachinid fly only hosts on Japanese beetles. It will not go after any other insect in the ecosystem. So they can be very host specific. Since Japanese beetles only feed on turf grass, that might be another reason to do away with turf grass. Absolutely, yes. We'll talk a little bit more about Japanese beetles and turf grass here in a little bit, but absolutely. Okay, pollinators. And I did a presentation on pollinators earlier in the season, so this next few slides might be a little bit of review for a few of you, but hopefully this is still good content. Why do we need pollinators? Pollinators facilitate plant reproduction, and over 75% of the plants in our world depend on pollinators to reproduce. And so that translates in terms of crops that we use for food, about 1/3 of the world's crops depend on insect pollinators. Bees alone can pollinate up to $15 billion worth of crops each year. And oftentimes that's the most nutritious part of our diet. It's often fruits, vegetables, and nuts. But even our meat and dairy industries depend on pollinating insects because cattle feed on alfalfa and clover, which are used to feed cattle. And when we think of pollinators, I think honeybees are the first one to come to mind, but we have such a wide diversity of pollinators. And so I'll point out a couple specialists that you might see in your own landscape. Bumblebees. Bumblebees do something called buzz pollination. So when they land on a plant, they have a specific vibration that releases the pollen from the plant. Other bees can't do that. Tomatoes and peppers and other nightshades need buzz pollination. So oftentimes in our greenhouses, they release bumblebees to help assist with that pollination. Cactus bees, the cactus flowers are blooming right now. They're actually, getting towards the tail end. If you get a chance, look inside cactus flowers. You'll see all kinds of biodiversity. But you'll also see some bees that specifically rely on cactus for them to complete their life cycle. Squash bees are native bees in North America, and they will come pollinate your squash. You plant it and they will come. They pollinate all species of squash and pumpkins. So honeybees cannot do that. Squash bees are way more efficient and they have the job done way early in the morning. And then yucca plants and yucca moths. That's a story of one where one cannot survive without the other. Without yucca plants, we would not have yucca moths, and without the moths, we would not have yucca plants. They're tiny little white moths, and the female moths are very savvy. They actually, they will hoard some of the pollen for their young, and then they deposit some of the pollen so the yucca plants can reproduce while saving enough for their offspring. And they actually they have little tentacles that they hold it under their chin. So the female yucca moths are very savvy and a very unique relationship. And pollination, in case you're not familiar with it, it's basically a pollinating insect visits the flower, and in that process, pollen grains are deposited on her body. Bees are so efficient at this because they have hairs all over their body that are specialized for collecting that pollen. And when she visits the next flower, she's depositing some of those pollen grains in the next flower. And in a nutshell, that facilitates plant reproduction. And we have so much biodiversity. In Colorado, we have over 1,000 species. I know that says 900 on the slide. Recent research show that we actually have over 1,000 species of bees that have been documented here in Colorado. Worldwide, 20,000, and North America, about 4,000. And I want to spend a couple minutes talking about bee life cycles because a lot of people assume all bees live in a hive, like a human-made hive, and that's not true. So I want to make sure you can find solitary bees in your own landscape. So let's talk about honeybees first. Honeybees are what are called a eusocial bee. And this is one of the only eusocial bees we have in North America. Honeybees are actually non-native. We brought them over from Europe in the 1600s, and they are a managed and domesticated species. That's important to note because honeybees, they have a wide variety of challenges facing them. Population decline and extinction is not one of them. Where all of our other wild bees and other insects at risk could face population decline or even extinction. So important to note when we think about managing wild bees and honeybees. Social bees have three characteristics: overlapping generations in a hive, a reproductive division of labor, meaning there is one queen, she's the only one that lays eggs, and cooperative brood care. So when honeybees turn about 9 or 10 days old, they actually become nurse bees, and they will take care of the larva or the baby bees within the hive. Now, the vast majority of bees are actually solitary, meaning they don't have a hive to protect. They don't interact with other bees. They visit our flowers all the time. They don't bother us. And so I encourage you to look for solitary bees next time you're in your garden. Most are actually going to live underground. And so here's a quick overview of their life cycle. The females emerge after winter, and she's going to pack that pollen and nectar into a tight ball called bee bread. She's going to deposit one egg on that bee bread, and then she's going to seal up her nest cell. She'll do it again and again and again throughout the season. Once fall and winter comes, her current life will come to an end, but her brood will be protected underground and will emerge the following year. 70% of all of our bees nest underground. So look at this middle picture here. That probably may look like ant holes to you and might not think anything of it, but I encourage you, if you see those this season, pause for a moment and see who's going in and out of those holes, because there's a good chance it could be solitary nesting bees. You may also find solitary nesting bees in a bee hotel. Or occasionally you'll find solitary bees nesting in a twig or other type of cavity or pre-existing tunnel. Here's what it looks like inside a twig. So you've got that bee bread and the larva feeding on the bee bread, and then this top left picture is a pupa. Primitively eusocial. So we got social bees, we've got solitary bees. Right in the middle are all of our bumblebees, and they have a very unique life cycle. And keep in mind, this is actually the same life cycle for wasps, our social wasps. We're going to talk about that in a minute. So queen bumblebees, hardy bumblebees. They're the only bees that hibernate as an adult bee over the winter. So she's going to find a nice pile of leaves, maybe a pile of logs, anywhere sheltered that's out of the elements, and she'll hibernate all winter. When spring arrives, she emerges, she wakes up, and she starts foraging for pollen and nectar. She will forage on a variety of flowers and then go find a place to build a nest. That nest is going to be underground or at any hollowed out cavity space that's usually underground. Old rodent or mouse nests are possible. She will lay generations of female worker bees, and then midsummer or so, she's going to lay eggs that are new males and new queens. The males and the queens, they leave the nest, they go find a mate, and then once fall and winter arrive, this current colony will come to an end, and the only survivors will be those newly mated queens. And so she'll hibernate and the cycle will repeat. So occasionally I hear from people, oh, I found this weird thing underground, with all these little pockets or little bubbles, and it's a bumblebee nest. So keep your eye out for that in your garden as well. Now, I think this is important because bees, wasps, and flies look so similar. So here's your pop quiz for the evening to help you learn a little bit about insect identification in your own garden. So pause for a second at each photo and think to yourself, am I a bee, a fly, or a wasp? And while you do that, I'm going to look at the questions we have. Okay, we're going to come back to the questions here in a moment. Hopefully you've had enough time to look at each picture. And here is your answer key. So you might be surprised to know the first 5 pictures are actually flies. Believe it or not, they are all flies. I'm going to tell you why in just a moment. The middle picture is a wasp, and these last 2 pictures are bees. So let's talk about why that is. How do you know if it's a wasp? Well, wasps have long, narrow bodies, and they usually do not have any hair, and they do not carry pollen. You'll see long, curly antenna, and oftentimes you'll notice this constriction between the thorax and the abdomen. It almost looks like someone went and pinched the wasp waist. Versus a fly. Now, the 2 instant characteristics to look for in a fly, look at these giant fly eyes that go to the top of the head. Wasps and bees, their eyes are more on the sides of their head. And flies have short, stubby antennae, which you can hardly even see sometimes. Those are your 2 characteristics to look for immediately. Otherwise, you might notice they only have 1 pair of wings. They usually are not hairy, but sometimes they can be hairy. They do not carry pollen, though. Bees carry pollen. Flies and wasps do not. Bees, on the other hand, have hairs on their body to carry pollen. You might see special pollen collecting hairs on their hind legs or under their abdomen. Honeybees and bumblebees will carry pollen in their pollen baskets. So you'll see balls of pollen and nectar in a ball on their hind leg. Their eyes are well separated on the sides of their head. So oftentimes there'll be a bend in their antenna. And bees come in all sizes, shapes, and colors. So you'll want to look for the hairs, look for the pollen, the eyes, and the antenna. So let's go back to that answer key. So in the first 5 pictures, even this one to the top right, it looks like a yellow jacket. I know it does. This is on a sunflower in my front yard. I live in South Denver. Sunflower in my front yard, but this is a fly. Look at those fly eyes and those short, stubby antenna. This bottom left picture here is a fly that mimics a bumblebee, but again, look at those giant eyes and short, stubby antenna. This middle wasp picture, long, narrow body, no hairs. It almost looks kind of shiny. And these 2 pictures are bees. Now, this second from the right is a wool carder bee. So you can see she's got little hairs on her body. She's actually got special hairs on the underside of her abdomen. You're going to see wool carder bees around your lamb's ear. Wool carder bees love fuzzy plants. She's going to scrape that fuzz off the lamb's ear or other fuzzy plants, and she'll line her nest cell with them. And this red bee right here, this is actually a cuckoo bee. So it's a parasite bee and will actually parasitize other bees. They aren't really pollinators, but you'll see them visiting flowers. Here's other examples of bees you might find in your garden. For size perspective, this top left picture is a little tiny bee in a bindweed flower, all the way to queen bumblebees that are nearly an inch long. And this photo here, second in from the, let's see, from the right, is a sunflower bee. Look at how much pollen she's got in those hind legs. You'll see leafcutter bees that have pollen underneath their abdomen. So much biodiversity. Now, one question I get is, to save the bees, should I become a beekeeper? And the short answer is depends on what your goals are. If your goals are conservation oriented, I actually would not recommend keeping honeybees because they are a non-native species. And if you have conservation goals in mind, you're going to want to plant flowers for the wild pollinators. Other reasons people keep bees are for the honey, the beeswax. Depending on what crops you're growing, they may pollinate specific crops. And beekeeping can be a very rewarding experience, but they will not help towards your conservation goals. So things to keep in mind if you're considering beekeeping: the time commitment. You do have to do hive inspections every so often. It is an expensive hobby. There's a chance for stings. Honeybees have a variety of challenges too. So considerations, but if that's something you want to pursue, that's great. But if your goals are conservation minded, really you want to plant flowers, provide habitats for all those wild pollinators. I'm happy to talk to anybody about this if you want to go more in depth. For the purposes of tonight, though, we are going to keep going. Swarm season is coming to an end, but if you do see a honeybee swarm, please call the swarm hotline. Don't panic. Just know that these little honeybees eat a lot of honey and they don't have a hive to protect. So they're actually very docile in their swarm state. So tell everyone around you to stay calm and be sure to call that swarm hotline. There's beekeepers all over Colorado that would love to come get those bees. And we have a wide variety of other pollinators in our gardens too. So let's run through some you might see. Hummingbirds, I know that's not an insect, but certainly a pollinator. Look at this broad-tailed hummingbird. She's got pollen on the top of her head. These hummingbirds are also going to prey on pest insects. 70% of their diet is actually insects. And so we love our hummingbirds in our gardens. Wasps, and we're going to talk more about wasps here. Wasps can be pollinators, not every species, but here in this picture are pollen wasps. They will actually visit flowers and feed on pollen and nectar. This time of year, you'll see their pointy little abdomens hanging out of penstemon flowers. So very cool. Look for those. Flies. We talked about syrphid flies being pollinators and they prey on pests. Pictured here is actually a bee fly, another very common visitor that you'll see in your garden flowers. Butterflies. We have over 250 species of butterflies here in Colorado. We're going to touch on them a little bit more. Beetles. You'll oftentimes find beetles foraging on flowers for pollen and nectar. And in that process, they can help pollinate plants. Pictured here is a soldier beetle, very common on like rabbit brush in the fall. Moths can also be pollinators. A couple more slides on them, but also critical pollinators, especially for our night blooming flowers. And bats. Bats are great for pest control, and they are also pollinators as well. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about butterflies. Actually, I'm going to pause. We're getting a lot of questions, so I'm going to answer a couple. Are bumblebees native and are they solitary? Bumblebees are native. Yes, we have 24 species in Colorado of bumblebee, all native. And are they solitary? You know, they're right in the middle. They have social characteristics, but they also have solitary characteristics. So it's called primitively eusocial, which is both social and solitary. Great question. And let's do one more. Are the plants you listed to attract insects were mostly non-native plants? Shouldn't you recommend native plants instead? Native plants increase biodiversity, which non-native plants do not. Yes, so native plants are outstanding, outstanding for our landscapes, and I highly encourage them. They're drought tolerant and they will attract a wide variety of pollinators and other beneficial insects too. Native plants are especially important for butterflies and moths because the caterpillars have very specific host plants. And so if you want to attract butterflies and moths, you want to figure out what those host plants are. And a lot of times they are native plants. So yeah, Sonia, I was not, didn't mean to digress and get away from native plants. There are also a lot of other great varieties out there that do provide a lot of nectar. My personal favorite is moon carrots, which is a non-native plant, but I have never seen so much biodiversity visiting moon carrot flowers than I have. Uh, yeah, on moon carrots. So there are some other great options that are non-native, but native plants are always an excellent option. All right, we'll come back to more questions here in a minute. So here's some examples of butterflies. Common species you might see. Monarch butterflies, they host on milkweed plants. Painted ladies host on thistles and mallow and sunflowers. These bottom two pictures, this is a two-tailed swallowtail and the caterpillar. Two-tailed swallowtails host on ash trees and chokecherries. Now, ash trees is a non-native species, where chokecherry is their native species. With emerald ash borer spreading throughout Colorado, we're going to lose a lot of our ash trees. And so I highly recommend planting chokecherries. It's great for birds, it's great for pollinators, and it's great for the two-tailed swallowtail caterpillars. We have a great fact sheet. You'll get a front and back information sheet, and one of those fact sheets outlines all the caterpillar host plants for butterflies in Colorado. Okay, this is an example of a variegated fritillary. A client at the extension office spent a lot of money on his pansies and had these caterpillars mowing them down. And so he was kind enough to save them. He did not kill them. And so I bought them their own pansies and reared them and set them free. So everything, identification is key. At first glance, this might look like a pest, but in reality, this is a welcome garden visitor in my landscape. The white-lined sphinx moth. This is one of the most common pollinating moths you may see in your garden. They host on a wide variety of plants, evening primrose, purslane, apple, elm, grape. One of their native host plants is sand verbena and 4 o'clocks. So you'll see these larger caterpillars feeding on those plants, and you'll see the adults visiting flowers. Don't fear, they will not hurt your tomato plants. Colorado actually has 30 species of sphinx moths. Sphinx moths are also known as hummingbird moths or hawk moths. And out of the 30 species, there's only 2 that will feed on your tomato plants, the tomato hornworm and the tobacco hornworm. If you see caterpillars anywhere else in your landscape feeding on anything else, they will not hurt your tomato plants. So it's an important distinction. And of course, if you do have a question about what is feeding on your plants, do reach out to your extension office. Okay, you may find leafcutter bees. If you see damage to leaves in your garden like this, know that it's a leafcutter bee. They won't harm your plants. They are simply, she's cutting out these leaf pieces to take back to her nest. If you find these plants with little notches like that, that could be root weevils, which is a whole nother thing, and reach out to your extension office about that. Okay, so how can you attract more beneficials to your landscape? Food, shelter, water, and space. We talked a little bit about flowers. You want to plant a diversity of flowers in your landscape. And you'll want to make sure you have blooms all season, so there's food available for these beneficial insects all season long. You'll want to avoid double flowers. Now, double flowers were bred intentionally to be big, beautiful flowers, but in that process, the plant reproductive parts were bred out of them meaning you have a sterile plant. There's no pollen or no nectar for those insects. So be sure, if you want to attract beneficial insects, find those single flowers and that have plant reproductive parts to attract those beneficial insects. As I mentioned before, native flowers, you can never go wrong. And there are great horticulture varieties out there as well. So there's a lot of great plant lists. I'll include that on the resource sheet. Okay, bee habitats and as well as other insect habitats, they need bare soil nesting areas. They need cavity nesting areas, like in a dead log, for instance. They need leaf mulch. They need all kinds of things, bees and other insects. And so this is where, if you choose to reduce your lawn and add in some drought-tolerant perennials, if you let your garden get a little bit messy, that can go a long way to support ground nesting bees and also other insects that overwinter as well. Insects also need a food source, so shallow dishes, bird baths can help too. Bee hotels are another great way to view bees, solitary bees that don't sting, in your garden landscape. I don't have time to get into too much detail here, but Michigan State University has a great fact sheet that will be on the resource list. If you happen to buy an insect hotel with these slots in them, I'd recommend filling in those slots. They're marketed to attract butterflies, but butterflies do not nest in them. Butterflies would much prefer to shelter in a tree or a shrub and not necessarily a bee hotel. What's going to happen is you're going to attract European paper wasps, which actually feed on those butterfly caterpillars. Okay, butterflies and moths. What else can you do for them? They need sheltering areas. So having layers, shrubs, trees, different places for them to rest. And planting those caterpillar host plants is key, as well as adding nectar plants. You can also cover plants since predation on butterfly and moth caterpillars is high from the invasive European paper wasp. So if you have caterpillars in your garden that you want to protect, you want to make sure that they complete their life cycle, you could consider covering them as well. Because what I hear a lot is, oh, I have monarch butterfly caterpillars. And then a few days later, they're gone. And so most likely European paper wasp probably preyed on those caterpillars. So we talked about trees and shrubs. Creating those different layers can provide a lot of habitat spaces. And grasses, we talk a lot about flowers for insects. Grasses provide overwintering areas, sheltering areas, and grasses are host plants for a lot of butterflies and moths. So a lot of our grasses, and actually here's a good list, are native grasses. They're drought tolerant and they can be wonderful additions to your landscape. And another bonus, by attracting more insects to your landscape, you're going to increase bird habitat as well. A research study by Doug Tallamy showed that it takes 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to rear one clutch of black-capped chickadees. 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars is huge. Hummingbirds can consume up to 2,000 insects a day. And this is where native plants can also be very important in attracting those insects, which then the birds can feed on as well. So you can't go wrong. If you're interested in learning more about bees specifically, check out nativebeewatch.org. We run a community science program where we actually train you to identify flower visitors and then submit the data for research. So check it out if you're interested. Let's talk about, is it a friend or is it a foe? And actually, I'm going to pause for a second to answer a couple of questions. Do we need to kill non-native or invasive bugs, say the European mantis or Japanese beetles? Japanese beetles, yes. European mantids, Probably not. They're around, but they aren't, their population isn't so high that they're causing any problems. So it really depends on the insect. There's non-native insects and there's also invasive insects. Japanese beetle is certainly an invasive species. We'll do one more. Are cutworms different than the grubs you showed? And I think you're probably referring to the grubs, the bumbleflower beetle grubs. Yes, cutworms are moth species, and there's a wide variety of species. So they're going to be more caterpillar-like versus the grubs in the picture were beetle grub. And if you have any questions on specific grubs, please reach out. Okay, friend or foe? Let's talk about wasps. There's so much misinformation around wasps, and they get a bad reputation. Wasps are actually friends, but I think a lot of people view them as foes. So let's talk about it. 90% of all insect stings are caused by the Western yellow jacket, not honeybees or other bees, and not even other wasps, just the Western yellow jacket. So of all wasps, this is probably the foe of all the wasps. But yellow jackets do have their role in the ecosystem. Their role is they're the ecosystem cleanup crew. They actually feed on carrion or dead things, removing that bacteria from the ecosystem and cleaning things up. Now you add humans into the picture. Yellow jackets love trash cans, barbecues, picnics, your sugary soda, and so you'll often see them flying around searching for food where there's human activity, and this is how stings happen. All the other wasps are a lot less likely to sting. Honeybees can sting if they're provoked or stepped on, but they actually die after they sting you, so they don't want to sting you. Wasps can sting multiple times. Honeybees can only sting once. And solitary bees, so a lot of our native bees, solitary bees, and solitary wasps either cannot or very rarely sting. So when we talk about planting flowers that attract bees or other insects, that's actually a very low risk for stings, because yellow jackets do not forage on flowers for nectar, yet they are responsible for 90% of the stings. So yellow jackets are, a lot of times considered a foe. If you have yellow jacket challenges, I recommend getting those pheromone yellow jacket traps. Do not buy the trap that uses sugar or UV light, otherwise you'll attract all the good insects. Make sure it's a pheromone trap and get those traps out in March or April, because if you do, you'll attract those new hibernating queens that are just emerging before she can start a colony. If you put those traps out in July, she could have 100 female workers in that nest already. So get those traps out early. They nest underground. So this can be a good way to differentiate yellow jackets from other wasps. If you find a hole with a bunch of yellow and black insects kind of guarding that home, stay far away. It's probably a yellow jacket nest, and it's really up to you to determine the sting risk of that nest. If it's close to human activity and there's a high sting risk, you'll probably want to call a professional to help remove that nest. If the nest is far away and not bothering anyone, probably fine to just leave it, because they only live 1 year and they will not return to that same nest the following year. European paper wasp. This is our other nuisance wasp or faux wasp. These wasps actually are not that aggressive unless their nest is threatened. They build these open-faced papery nest cells under a house eave, in a shed, a dark place, and oftentimes stings will happen if someone goes into that shed and they don't know the nest is there. Otherwise, when you see them foraging on flowers, they're really not gonna sting. This is an invasive species, though. This species is not supposed to be here. Their populations are way high, and they prey on butterfly and moth caterpillars. Sometimes it's pest caterpillars. A lot of times it's beneficial caterpillars as well. So they've dramatically altered our garden ecosystems. If you have European paper wasps, this is where you may consider safely using things like wasp sprays. If you happen to knock a nest nest down, be sure you hose that area down because that pheromone will stay. And if there's any survivors, they'll start building a brand new nest again. So European paper wasps. You may also come across bald-faced hornet or aerial yellow jacket nests. Now, these wasps build those funnel-shaped nests that we see often in like cartoons. And oftentimes they're high in a tree. Most people don't even notice they're there until the leaves fall off the tree in the fall. Well, by that point, their colony is about to die off anyway because winter's coming. They only live 1 year. Most of the time, these wasps do not cause any problems unless you hire an arborist who's climbing a tree, or if you have children climbing trees, you need to be careful. But otherwise, if no one's in the tree, usually these are just fine to leave and they don't bother people at all. These wasps do prey on a lot of pest insects, and so they do offer benefits for us. And then these are our friends. We have thousands of species of solitary wasps in our gardens all the time, every day, hunting spiders, crickets, caterpillars, and they just do their own thing. Most of the time, these wasps are not going to sting unless you actually pick up the wasp or have it pressed up against your skin. Some of these wasps actually can't sting. Like, look at this bottom middle picture here. That's what looks like a stinger is an ovipositor used to lay eggs in the bark of dying trees. So she doesn't harm the tree. She can't harm humans, but she will lay her eggs in dead or dying trees. So all these wasps do provide benefits. They keep to themselves. They're not going to sting you. Definitely put these in the friend category. And you may even have solitary wasps in your bee or insect hotel. Again, these are solitary wasps, meaning they are not going to bother you. They're not going to sting. So this can be a great opportunity to watch these wasps and their life cycle without the risk of getting stung. Remember when the northern giant hornet was around? Friend or foe? This would be a foe. This was an invasive species, not in Colorado, it's only in Northeast Washington, and they have since eradicated it. Kind of a nickname of murder hornets, which I'm not really sure why, because it's an insect predator, just like hundreds of thousands of other insects. But this did invoke a lot of fear. Well, no need to worry, since it was successfully eradicated from Washington. Even if it wasn't, you will not find northern giant hornets in Colorado because they could not survive in our climate. We are dry and high elevation. Two environmental factors that the northern giant hornet does not like. So don't worry about these coming to Colorado. You may come across another garden visitor called the pigeon tremix. Now, this is a larger wasp, and so when the murder hornet, when it made the news during the pandemic, we were inundated with calls about the pigeon tremix. This wasp could not sting you if she tried. This is an ovipositor used to lay eggs in the bark of dead and dying trees. So she can't hurt you. She is just a little bit larger though, which I know sometimes looks scary, but completely harmless to humans, completely harmless to those trees. Cicadas, friend or foe? I think it depends on your opinion on this one. I think there's a lot of people in the Midwest and the East Coast that are not too big of a fan because they're inundated with cicadas right now. The 17-year and the 13-year cicadas have emerged this season, and they're everywhere. So there's a lot of people that aren't too big fans of that, but in general, cicadas are a friend. They feed a lot of birds and other animals in the ecosystem. They do not harm plants, and they're just kind of a unique insect. Here in Colorado, we have 29 species. We do not have the 17-year or the 13-year cicadas. Most of our cicadas are gonna be 3 to 5 year life cycles. So they will spend 3 to 5 years of their life underground, and then they will emerge, find a mate, reproduce, and then their larva will stay underground for the next 3 to 5 years, depending on the species. So They're hard to find. Sometimes you're more likely to hear them, like that buzzing, the zzz. That is a male trying to find a mate. You might also, we have a species called the Putnam's cicada, which makes a clicking noise, like, and if you hear that in the evenings, you may have Putnam cicadas in your landscape. So harmless, important insects in our ecosystem, and yeah, cicadas are a fun friend. Aphids, friend or foe, depends on who you ask. Aphids occasionally can damage a plant, like really impact the overall plant's health. Quite often, though, in a homeowner landscape setting, it might look alarming that you see so many aphids, but they really aren't going to hurt the overall plant's health. So I love seeing aphids in my landscape. And in my case, they don't harm any plants. So they'll feed on the fluids, and some of the branches will be sacrificed. But overall, the plants still stay very healthy. Aphids are great because they attract so much biodiversity to your landscape, and they will feed so many different insects. In fact, if you do have aphids in your garden, I recommend looking and counting the different types of insects that you might see feeding on them. You'll be amazed. Um, Aphids also produce honeydew, which is a sugary, it's basically their feces, but it's very sugary, and that feeds ants and other insects as well. So before looking to control aphids, I would pause and admire the biodiversity. If you do need to control aphids, the best thing you can do is actually hose down the aphids on your plants, because the impact of a jet of water will kill the aphids, or knock them off so they can't get back up on the plants. And that way you're not harming the beneficial insects as well. Uh, One unique thing about aphids is they do something called parthenogenesis, which is actually asexual reproduction. And so that's how aphids can produce so rapidly. Basically, they don't need sexual reproduction to reproduce. And so they're basically identical clones or identical sisters of each other. They do sexual reproduction as well, but they can also do asexual reproduction. Couple other friends or foes. These tend to be, I think, foes from a human perspective. Box elder bugs, completely harmless, but they do congregate on your house or a building, and they overwinter as adults. So they're looking for a warm place to hang out. You probably have a box elder tree nearby. They feed on the seeds of box elder trees. So harmless, but they can be a nuisance in your home or your garden ecosystem. Similarly, the Western conifer seed bug often attracts attention, overwinters as an adult, looks for those, wants to come in your home. These are solitary insects, so usually you only see one or two, but they're a little bit larger, so sometimes they attract attention. They feed on the seeds of pine trees. So again, a harmless insect, but definitely sometimes a nuisance. So if you struggle with either of these insects, the best thing to do is figure out where they're coming in and seal up those entry points to your home. In severe cases with box elder bugs, if they're really driving you crazy, you may consider removing that box elder tree, because that will, if there's no food there, the insects will not hang out there. Spiders, friend or foe? Well, generally, I know spiders invoke a lot of fear sometimes, but in general, spiders are friends. They provide very important pest control services in our gardens. They build webs, and they use those webs to catch their prey. Other spiders will ambush to capture their prey, and they'll actually seek out their prey to hunt. Spiders can be very challenging to identify. So if you're curious about what the spider is, I recommend getting a picture. You can start with your extension office, and or visit the Denver Museum of Nature and Science's website. They are the spider experts, and they have a citizen science project on spiders. So spiders are beneficial. One study from 2017 estimated that spiders consume 400 to 800 million tons of prey every single year. So a huge amount of prey on insect prey that they consume. Aphids, moths, beetles, flies, and more. Are spiders dangerous? There's a lot of misinformation around this. So let's dive in. Spiders are typically not aggressive and they will only bite when they are trapped up against your skin. They never seek out humans to bite them. It's only when they're pressed up against their skin. Spiders would much rather keep to themselves. Here in Colorado, the only venomous spider we have is the black widow. If you are bit by a black widow, do seek medical care immediately. Black widows, though, they really prefer to keep to themselves. They're going to find a dark, quiet space, and they're going to stay at their nest. And so, oftentimes, a black widow bite happens if somebody doesn't know the nest is there, the spider is there. But they do prey on other insects. The other spider that gets a lot of attention that is not in Colorado is the brown recluse. Denver Museum of Nature and Science has only found a couple brown recluse spiders ever in Colorado. So if a brown recluse spider is here, it likely hitched a ride, it traveled, it got here somehow. They do not live in Colorado. So if you do think you have a spider and you're wondering if it's venomous or not, do consider asking a professional for some identification help. But brown recluse spiders, not in Colorado. Black widows are in Colorado, not too common, and they prefer to keep to themselves. A lot of misinformation around spiders. Like this was a Facebook post that circulated that this new spider was killing people. False information. So definitely check your sources. The spider in this picture is actually a woodlouse spider, probably found in every house in North America. These are roly-poly hunters. So they specifically seek out roly-polies or pill bugs to eat. Again, they could bite if they're pressed up against your skin, but they like to keep to themselves. And they are not aggressive at all. Funnel weaver spiders are one of the most common spiders you'll see in gardens and sometimes in homes. And they build funnel-shaped webs to help catch their prey. Due to time, I am going to speed up just a hair. So if you have additional questions on spiders, do reach out. Jumping spiders are one of my favorite groups of spiders. They have big eyes so they can hunt their prey. They're excellent jumpers, not aggressive, and again, will only bite if they are pressed up against your skin. They do something called ballooning. So those little babies will, they'll make a little bit of web and into the air, and the wind will actually help disperse those babies. Wolf spiders are also very common. They can be large, so it might look a little bit scary, but wolf spiders, again, are harmless and important predators. You'll know if it's a wolf spider if you see a female with little spiderlings on her abdomen. Wolf spiders take care of their young. They're one of the only species, in the arthropod world that really shows some of that maternal care. So you'll know it's a wolf spider if you see spiderlings on the back of a wolf spider. Cat face spiders, very common in the fall, right around Halloween, which is very appropriate. They will hunt other insects. They make these beautiful, intricate webs. Again, harmless, an important predator in our garden. So what do you do about spiders? It really depends on your comfort level. You can catch them and release them. Some people choose to leave the spiders in their home because they're going to prey on other insects in their home. If you don't, want nothing to do with spiders in your home, you can figure out where they're coming in at and seal those areas. That's going to be the long-term solution. Really, pesticides are not all that effective. So keep that in mind. You could reduce outdoor lighting, keep the webs washed, up against your doors, or wherever there's human activity, and things like that can go a long way. Earwigs. Earwigs are sometimes a nuisance. Are they a friend or a foe? Well, they kind of get a bad reputation. Earwigs actually feed on decaying matter. Very rarely do they actually feed on plants. They get the blame for feeding on plants, but quite often they're just feeding on decaying matter, and they just look for places in plants to hide, to find a cool place to hang out. So earwigs are a non-native species, but they are decomposers. Sometimes they can be a nuisance when there's high numbers. So there are control options available that will be included in the resource sheet. Okay, so we're going to talk real quick about some garden foes, and then we will get back to questions. Garden foes, flea beetles. Flea beetles feed on a variety of vegetables and sometimes other plants. You'll know it's a flea beetle based on this shot hole appearance. And, they're especially detrimental to new seedlings. If it's an established plant, it's not going to be as big of a deal. So what can you do? If you plant more seedlings than you need, you can actually thin out some of the plants and use trap plants. So for instance, you could plant radish to help protect broccoli and cabbage. In extreme cases, you could consider adding floating row covers or screens to protect those plants. And some people will use sweep nets or even little portable vacuums to get some of those beetles. Those are really going to be your most effective options. Squash bugs are also a nuisance this time of year. They particularly go after winter squash and pumpkins. They feed on the sap from plants. And so mulch in our gardens actually provides shelter for them. So if you know you have squash bugs, if you can remove some of that debris, you will remove nesting areas as well. You can also hand pick, once your plants are established, look under the leaves and look for those eggs and destroy those eggs. There can be insecticide options if needed, but removing some of those nesting areas can go a long way. Japanese beetles. Now I have about 12 minutes left and I want to answer some questions. So I am actually going to skip ahead a little bit. Japanese beetles are an invasive species that impact a lot of our gardens, especially along the Front Range of Colorado. They are pretty well established and they were most recently found on the west slope. That is very alarming because the Japanese beetles is going to impact the fruits and crop production on, in Palisade and other areas. So we're very concerned about that. I will say, be aware of lookalikes. Make sure you do know how to identify Japanese beetles and leave the other beetles alone. They overwinter underground under our turf grass. And so we are about to see Japanese beetles emerge. And the females will start laying eggs in July and August. And then once winter comes, they will dig deep into the soil to protect themselves from winter. And then in the spring, they will emerge again. They can damage the lawn as grubs, and they feed heavily on plants as adults. So that's a larva. I'm just kidding. They are not that big, I promise. Japanese beetle larvae are about 1/2 inch in size. And I mentioned that rastral pattern at the tip of their abdomen, if you're really curious, is how you can confirm what species of grub you have. So in terms of a lawn, Japanese beetles can only survive in well-irrigated lawns. A lot of times homeowners don't keep their lawns wet enough for Japanese beetles to survive. So that is going to be your easiest control option for grubs in the lawn. You can let your turf grass dry out in between waterings. Grubs cannot survive. Even if you have adults in your landscape, you may not have grubs in your lawn. They're going to be nesting in the golf course or the park nearby and not necessarily your lawn. If you're noticing brown spots, a lot of times people assume that it is grubs, when the vast majority of time, there's actually gaps in our irrigation systems that we can't see when we run the sprinkler system. So if you're keeping a lawn and you want to maximize your efficiency, get little cups and put them in your lawn, run your irrigation system, and see what areas are getting water and what areas are getting less water. Even, here we have 0.1 inches in this cup and 0.2 inches. This 0.2 inches is getting double the amount of water all the time. And so that's why this area is green, most likely, versus this one is brown. So irrigation audits will save on your water bill. It'll make your grass greener, and you won't have to apply grub control products when you don't have grubs. So I'm gonna, another thing you can do, we automatically, set our sprinkler systems to go out 3 times a week, and then we forget about it. If you're more mindful about watering, and watch your sprinkler system run, you can often figure things out, like, do you have gaps in your irrigation system? Or is my turf grass completely dry? Do I even need to water it yet? Maybe I'll wait another day so the grass can dry out, so I can ensure I don't have grubs. Easy grub control. Just make sure, you don't want your grass to die from drought stress. So it is something you want to keep an eye on it. And other, general turf care, aeration, fertilizing can go a long way to keeping your grass healthy as well. There are grub control products. Nematodes are a great option, and milky spore is not effective, but this Bacillus thuringiensis, or BT, is very effective on Japanese beetles. I would make sure you have grubs before applying grub control, though. Might as well. Save the time and resources if you can. In terms of the landscape, Japanese beetles do feed on over 300 types of plants. They will skeletonize the leaves, and they will feed on hot days, and they will feed in aggregations. What can you do? Hand picking is critical. Because it'll protect your plants. You can squish them. That was a myth for a while. Squish to your heart's content. By hand picking beetles off your own plants, you are protecting your plants. Throw those beetles in a bucket of soapy water. Feed them to your chickens. We don't recommend pheromone traps because they will actually attract more beetles to the area. The pheromone is very, very strong. And so if they are flying to that trap, they might find your plants along the way. So if you want to use a trap, be sure you have it at least 30 feet away from any important vegetation to prevent Japanese beetles from feeding on your plants. If you choose to use other products to control Japanese beetles, just be mindful of all the pollinators and beneficial insects, because you don't want to eliminate the beneficial insects when controlling Japanese beetles, because those beneficial insects prey on other insects, they pollinate our plants, and they're very important. We have a great fact sheet on this with more information. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. There are a lot of preferred plants by Japanese beetles, but I would say if you're adding new plants to your landscape, reach out. There's a lot of plants that Japanese beetles don't feed on, or other varieties of, say, of roses or crabapple trees. There are options available. So I know they're a tedious pest, but certainly don't give up. All right. I have 6 minutes left. What I will say about emerald ash borer is, depending on where you live in Colorado, depends on if you need to take action against emerald ash borer. Emerald ash borer is spreading throughout Colorado. It is a pest that we do need to worry about because all of our ash trees will eventually be impacted. So I will say, if it's in your neighborhood, reach out to your extension office for control options. Whether you save the tree, remove the tree, there are options available. If emerald ash borer is not in your area, but you have ash trees, be thinking about a plan. Have a plan in place, because eventually you will have to make a financial decision whether or not to treat that tree or to remove that tree. I do want to share, this is one of the most recent maps of where emerald ash borer is in Colorado. So you'll see it was found in Boulder County back in 2013 and has slowly been spreading. We did have suspected firewood transports, and that's how it got to Littleton last year and in Carbondale last year. So do be mindful. You never want to transport ash wood, and just firewood in general. We do anticipate it slowly spreading. If you're in the Denver area, Aurora, or anywhere else, you probably don't need to take action yet, but keep an eye on where the infestation is and certainly reach out to your extension office. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit due to time. One of the absolute giveaway signs that you have EAB is that D-shaped exit hole in an ash tree. If you see that, do call your extension office. All right. I'm sorry I have to skip these a little far ahead, but I do want to make sure that we have time for questions. So again, if you have any other questions about Emerald Ash Borer, there are some great options. I would recommend emamectin benzoate gives you 2 to 3 years of control. The other ones only 1 year. As a director, you might be able to get 2 years. So weigh your pros and cons. There's pros and cons to every option. And if you're going to replace your tree, there's some great options as well. Okay, so I know I flew through that last part, the foes. I'm going to answer questions in the chat box. Okay. I have run into ground-dwelling bees that can be very aggressive about stinging. Oops, hold on. Very aggressive about stinging, which I know is death to them. Maybe they only attack when threatened. Is there a way that I can avoid being attacked by ground bees? Kathy, I suspect they might not be bees. If you identification is going to be key. If you can get a picture without getting stung or anything, send me an email and I can help you figure out exactly what they are. My first thought is that actually they might be yellow jackets, because honeybees typically aren't going to live underground, and solitary bees won't attack you. So I'm wondering if they're yellow jackets, but send me a picture if you can, and I'll help you troubleshoot that one. What can be done about insects that are normally beneficial, but can get out of control and become a pest? For example, I have an issue with pill bugs munching all my veggies down to sticks. That's a great question. And for pill bugs specifically, I'm going to have to look into that because I can't remember off the top of my head. If you want to shoot me an email, we have a great fact sheet on pill bugs and I'd be happy to help you with that. But I apologize. I'm drawing a blank on that off the top of my head. I have an underground nest of wasps. I think that they are wasps because the whole colony lives underground and bees usually live above ground, right? Well, so solitary bees, a lot of them do nest underground, but they're gonna be solitary, so that's not gonna be a whole colony of them. You might see a lot of holes in one area, but those bees, they're doing their own thing. They are not a collective unit. So I suspect you're right though. If it is a colony that's living underground, again, that might be yellow jackets. If you can get a picture, feel free to send it to me and I can confirm that. Or if you can describe too what the insects look like, we can definitely troubleshoot that. Can you repeat the bee hotline? Yes, we will put that in the chat box real quick. I'll get that there real quick. Okay, it's all right. Bee swarm hotline. It is 1-844 spy bees. Okay, great question. What role do shield bugs play? I see them on my raspberries and sometimes on my garden plants. So there's a wide variety of species, and a lot of those shield bugs might actually be stink bugs. And some stink bugs feed on plants, and others will prey on insects. So it all depends on the species. If you do see pictures, if you do see them, feel free to take a picture, and happy to give you more information on that specific species. We do have one invasive species of stink bug called the brown marmorated stink bug, but we also have a wide variety of other species. You'll find stink bugs that are green and brown. Most often, they're not going to do any harm in a home landscape. Sometimes in crop settings, they can cause damage, but in a home landscape, in a home landscape, they're usually not too bad. Okay, ooh, this is a good one. Are nativars close to the same value as native plants? The short answer is we don't really know. What we do know is native plants are super awesome for all the pollinators and beneficial insects. Most likely, a lot of our nativars provide a lot of nutrition and resources for those insects too. And it's probably going to be different depending on the type of plant. So I know this is a big area of research and everybody wants to know. It's not a black and white answer though. So I would say, plant native plants, plant nativars that are attracting insects. If you see them attract insects, there must be something good in them. And stay tuned as we're all interested to know that answer for the future. Can you keep wasps away from your outdoor food activities by having a distracting smell, citronella or incense? Yellow jackets are probably not going to be attracted with citronella or incense. You can, like if you're having a barbecue, sometimes, with varying levels of efficiency, you can put a little bit of food like away from the barbecue, and hopefully the yellow jackets will go there and they can just feed there and leave you alone. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. It could be worth a try, but they're attracted to the smell of the food usually. So you'll want to have, if you're going to attract them elsewhere, you'll probably need similar smells, and they probably are not going to be attracted to citronella or incense, unfortunately. If yellow jackets are a problem, do get those pheromone traps. Now, keep in mind the pheromone has to be replaced every 2 to 4 weeks too. So if you put one out in the spring, you'll want to keep up on replacing that pheromone in the evenings, so you can help get some control. What do you do if the wasps get into cantaloupes while they're still growing in the garden? Ooh, that's a new one. I don't know the answer to that. Kayleen, send me an email and we can look into that. I'm not sure off the top of my head what you could do about that, but we'll find something. And I know we're at 8:03, so feel free if you need to go. Thanks for joining tonight. I'm going to keep answering a few questions, but I sure appreciate you all coming tonight. Okay, is there any way to control earwigs? They eat everything in my vegetable gardens, from large zucchinis to kale to chard. I took a photo last night of a small kale leaf with over 10 earwigs on it. Yes, you can develop a trap. If you get layers of newspaper and you put something like wheat germ in there, the earwigs will be attracted to that, and then you can get those layers of cardboard or newspaper and then put them in the trash. That can be an easy way. So it sets up a trap, and you're getting rid of a large number of individuals. I'm also going to put in the chat box a fact sheet on earwigs that will have other options. Give me just 1 second. Okay, I'm going to put the link in the answer to your question. Okay. Oh, grasshoppers. I'm seeing questions on grasshoppers. Grasshoppers are really tough, and it's already been a bad year for grasshoppers, unfortunately. Um, Grasshoppers are best controlled early on in the season when the grasshoppers are really young. Once they become an adult, they're so mobile, it's hard to control. Their eggs are laid. They overwinter as eggs in the soil. So that can be another way to control very early on in the season. At this point, there's not a lot of options. I will put a fact sheet that has some insecticide options that are available. Let me get this real quick, and that will outline the different control options and the pros and cons and considerations. Grasshoppers are tough though, I will say. And if they're growing in a vegetable garden too, be mindful if you do try an insecticide product to control grasshoppers, make sure you read that label, and make sure it is safe to apply to like a vegetable garden. I haven't seen Japanese beetles yet this season. So what other insect is skeletonizing my plants overnight? Squash, radish, pole beans, and even carrots. Um, Off the top of my head, I'm not sure. Um, Japanese beetles are not out yet, but they're any day, probably in the next week or two, they will be out. Um, I don't know. If you want to send me pictures, we can try to figure it out. It's likely something that's feeding at night, which is why you're not seeing them. But maybe if I can see the damage, we could figure out what is feeding on them. But off the top of my head, I'm not positive on that one, Kim. So send me an email with pictures. I heard Boulder signed up for ash borer control using non-biting wasps that love their larvae. Do you know anything about the status of this program? Kathy, you're right. So Boulder did release some parasitoid wasps. Parasitoid wasps are non-stinging wasps that parasitize emerald ash borer, and they did that a while ago. I don't know. I don't think they've done any releases since that I'm aware of. And so it's possible maybe that didn't turn out to be an effective way. It didn't control emerald ash borer well. But I have not heard an update on that actually. So, but to my knowledge, I don't think they've done any more releases recently. But that's a good question. I'll have to look into that. And okay, one more grasshopper question. So Lynn, I'm gonna put the grasshopper link into the chat box. Okay. I've had an infestation of blister beetles the last few years. Is there any benefit to them that I am overlooking? Is there a predatory insect I could use to biocontrol their population? Um, there is not a biocontrol option that I am aware of. Blister beetles, they do prey on other insects. And so they are beneficial in our ecosystem, but they can also be a pest. And I would say with blister beetles specifically, make sure you're not touching them, because true to their name, they do have a skin irritant on them that can actually irritate your skin. So you do handle them or you do try to control them, make sure you're wearing gloves and other protective equipment. And I actually have a good fact sheet for that. So I'll post that in the answer. And that will go into a lot more detail on blister beetles. All right. Any other questions? Thanks for bearing with me. I know I'm 8 minutes over. Thanks for hanging in there, and I hope you learned a lot. Be sure to reach out if you have any questions. And thank you all so much for attending tonight.
Thanks, Lisa. Oh my gosh, I learned so much. Your excitement is infectious. I'm excited to share these facts with my friends this summer as we're in our yards. So thank you. Thank you all for attending. Thank you, City of Boulder, for making this seminar possible. We very much appreciate your partnership. Our seminar series will continue to run through August, so be sure to check out our website to sign up for some more seminars. And then when you exit tonight, after I close this, there will be a survey link pop up. We'd love to hear about your experience tonight. Otherwise, that link will also be in an email, a follow-up email tomorrow or the next day. So we value your feedback, and so please help us out and take a moment to fill that out. Thanks again, everyone, and have such a great evening.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Crystal.